Welcome, everyone, to this webinar titled Between Partisan War and Genocide, Yugoslavia 1941 to 1945. I'm Jason Dawsey, Assistant Teaching Professor of History at Arizona State University, and delighted to be involved in a conversation today with a scholar who has done so much great work on Yugoslavia during World War II, and that is Dr. Emil Kerenji. And I want to say a little bit about him and about his areas of expertise and his publications before we get into the conversation proper. Dr. Kerenji is applied research scholar at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 2008 and joined the Mandel Center at USHMM the following year. He is a historian of modern Jewish and East European history with expertise in the history of the Holocaust and World War II in Yugoslavia and the Balkans more broadly. And his research focuses on the relationship of genocidal violence against Jews and violent nationalizing regional policies of those states that were allied with the Third Reich. I just want to note three publications of Dr. Kerenji's out of many. I think the three that directly speak to the topic of our webinar today. He is completing a work entitled Post-War Justice in Yugoslavia 1943 to 1949, Between Justice and Legitimation. And this will be a digital publication, an open access publication. Last year, 2025, he published German and Local Violence in the Balkans in the Cambridge History of the Holocaust, Volume 2, edited by Mary Fulbrook and Jürgen Matthäus. That's a piece of, in fact, that will address some of the things we're going through today. And I'm especially interested in a 2016 article that Dr. Kerenji did in Contemporary European History. Your Salvation is the Struggle Against Fascism, Yugoslav Communists and the Rescue of Jews, 1941, 1945. Dr. Kerenji, thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Jason. It's great to be here, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. And I'm ready for your questions. Before we start, I should note that all views expressed here are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Well, we are really grateful that you took the time to speak with us today. I think this is a subject, Emil, that doesn't get nearly the attention that it deserves in the U.S., which is World War II in Yugoslavia, the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, partisan war in Yugoslavia. People are certainly familiar with the name Tito. We will obviously talk about him today, but most people don't know a great deal about him or really about the course of the war, not least because there's very limited U.S. involvement in Yugoslavia during the war. But we want to try to close that gap a bit today, and we'll try to do so with a series of questions here. And the first one, just getting us going, gets to the beginnings of World War II for the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So this is where I would like to begin. The armed forces of Nazi Germany, along with Italian and Hungarian units, the Bulgarian military would soon be involved, attacked Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941, the same day that Hitler also went to war against Greece. The Yugoslav military surrendered 11 days later on April 17th. Greece did so on April 21st. So, Emil, this giving some background, I think, for our audience here, what should we know about the then Kingdom of Yugoslavia?
That's a great question. And when we talk about this history, I think it's important to know that Yugoslavia, or as it was called at its founding in 1918, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, was a newcomer, a new state that emerged on the European map after World War One. And it was part of this new post-Versailles order, in which self-determination and the emergence of new nations in Europe was the kind of zeitgeist in that era. It was founded in the Western Balkans, and it encompassed the former parts of the Ottoman and Habsburg Empire. So it was basically a post-imperial space with territories in which the majority of the population spoke a language that we call today BCMS, which to me sounds like a mad cow disease moniker, but it means Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Serbian. Basically, about 20 million people today speak that language, and that was the language of the Slavs, of the Southern Slav populations of the Ottoman and the Habsburg empires. The various territories that made it into Yugoslavia were at various political stages of their existence. Serbia had already been an independent kingdom, which emerged as an independent country during the 19th century from the Ottoman Empire. And then there were also former Ottoman territories, what is today the Republic of Northern Macedonia, some territories that had switched hands between the empires, like Bosnia and Herzegovina, which until 1878 was a westernmost territory of the Ottoman Empire, and then from that year on became occupied by Austria-Hungary, later annexed to Austria-Hungary. And then areas like Croatia and Slovenia, which had been, Croatia especially, had a level of autonomy and semi-autonomy under the Hungarian crown. So all these territories were very different, and Yugoslavia was thus became this collection of different territories that were finally united into this new kingdom. Now, when I say a new country, it was new politically in the sense that it was, there was a new country called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. But throughout the 19th century, especially in the second half of the 19th century, there were various national movements in the region that envisioned some kind of scenario in which the Slavs of the south, of the areas under the Austrian Empire, later Austria-Hungary, and then the Ottoman Empire would come together and form a union. That was not a new idea. The language that became the common language over the 19th century was standardized in different parts of what was later to become the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, in order so that people from these different areas can speak the same vernacular and that it's mutually intelligible, because there was some sense of the common destiny and the political future of these peoples. So it's not that it just emerged overnight. There were long time debates about what should this future country, and Yugoslavia is this kind of name that was kind of semi-utopian, a place that nobody knew if it would exist and finally come into being. But it basically, in the South Slavic languages, Yugoslavia means basically translates as the land of South Slavs. It was always envisioned to be the country in which or political union of the finally liberate peoples of that language being liberated from imperial rule, whether it was from Vienna or Budapest or Istanbul. There were different visions of this unity. More, some people were understanding Yugoslavia as just an extension of the Serbian state. Some people were striving for some kind of democratic republic. There were the understanding was, yes, there will be, we are, our destiny is the same. We are destined to become politically unified or to live in some kind of political union, but it's not clear what this union was going to be. And then World War I basically forced the hand of the unification, because it didn't come, the unification when it came in 1918 didn't come as a negotiated, democratically established agreement about this country, this new state, but came as a result of basically Serbian army pushing from the southern front of World War I, liberating Serbia, and then not stopping at Serbian borders and pushing all the way through the northern Adriatic. And then immediately this was now the new country. And so there was initially a lot of enthusiasm for this country across these newly liberated regions, but it soon became clear that the country was little more than just an extension of the pre-war Serbian kingdom. It was ruled by the Serbian king from before the war, Peter I. Its bureaucratic and administrative and police apparatus was basically extension from the Serbian institutions pre-World War I. And so very soon a sense of disappointment and dissatisfaction emerged among the non-Serb populations in Yugoslavia. This was not what they envisioned this new Yugoslav state would be. And this history, these 20 years or so between the unification and the destruction in 1941 with the coming of World War II, were riddled with political strife, sometimes descending into violence. And the main question was this kind of question of the centralized kingdom or a decentralized republican settlement for Yugoslavia. A lot of this is usually articulated as an ethnic strife, because the Croats, for example, were the largest population with the largest single political party, which opposed traditionally the Serbian dynasty and the domination of the Serbian institutions of the state. But it was also a question of federalism, a question of centralization, and it is this kind of, I don't want to say weakness, because it's a teleological expression. It presupposes that it was bound to collapse, but this was this kind of political situation that escalated up in the years leading up to World War I, was something that Hitler later used to divide and partition Yugoslavia. So I would say that's something we should have in mind when talking about the eve of World War II. And I should maybe just also say a few words about the outbreak of the war. Both Yugoslavia and Greece were attacked as you mentioned, on April 6th, 1941. This was not just a random coincidence. This was the result of a set of factors that affected Hitler's decision making. The context of this time, the spring of 1941, was that Nazi Germany was preparing for the most fateful operation of the entire war, the invasion of the Soviet Union. And they basically needed peace in their backyard, which was the Balkans. They needed a situation in which there would be no war and the situation would be, the security would be maintained. And this was threatened by two factors. One was the war between Italy and Greece. Italy had invaded Greece in 1940, and that's a whole other conversation about Italian imperialism in the Mediterranean. But anyway, after Albania, they invaded Greece in the fall of 1940. And after initial success, the Greek army actually managed to arrest this attack and even reverse some of the territorial gains that Italians made in Greece and push into Albania itself, which was the basis for the Italian attack. And so that was the reason number one for Hitler to kind of pacify this area, because also he couldn't countenance the humiliation that the Italians were suffering in the Balkans. And then the thing that cemented the decision to wage war in the Balkans was a coup in Belgrade on March 27th, 1941. So it is important also here for this particular event to know the background of the Tripartite Pact, which was the agreement signed between Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo in the fall of 1940, and which all countries and new countries in Central Europe signed over the months following. So Hungary joined the pact in November 1940, followed by Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria on March 1st, 1941, and Yugoslavia on March 25th, 1941. After long political pressure by Nazi Germany to do so. When word, this was done in Vienna, the Tripartite Pact, where Yugoslavia became a member of the pact, was signed in Vienna on the March 25th, 1941. As word got out into the country, 2 days later, there was a coup in which pro-Western, anti-Nazi, more anti-German, I should say, officers deposed the regent, Paul, and instituted their own the military government and proclaimed the King Peter II, who was under 18. They proclaimed that he was now king, and even though they rushed to reassure Germany that this was purely internal development, that the situation is under control and Yugoslavia is secure, Hitler, these were the two main factors: the war in Greece and the coup in Yugoslavia, with strong anti-German sentiments, that he decided that Germany needs to take care of this before they turned their attention to the East.
This is extremely helpful background, Emil. There's so many factors at play here, and you've noted um, these kind of ethno-nationalist tensions in Yugoslavia already, the dominance of Serbia in this kingdom for many years, and now being pulled into um, World War II with Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and allies moving into the country. So that leads me then to this next question about what's going to happen after April 17th. It is pretty astonishing what occurs following Hitler's victory in terms of the territorial integrity of Yugoslavia. Can you take us through how Yugoslavia was essentially dismantled and what replaced it in 1941?
Yes, and can should ask Jan to give us, please, the slide number 2, which should be the map of yes, of occupied, the previous one, yes, occupied and partitioned Yugoslavia on the eve of the Italian collapse. But basically, this is what became of the country since the defeat of the spring of 1941. Um, Hitler's strategic plan, as I said, the main idea was that Germany needed security and peace in the region. And Hitler basically bet that if he was to placate the traditional enemies of Yugoslavia and their territorial and national aspirations, their loyalty would guarantee the peace in the region, and would kind of allow him to turn his attention elsewhere, as I said, on the attack of the Soviet Union. And so, and then there was also the equally important, I should say, was this idea that Serbs need to be punished. We should recall that, again, 1941 was barely a generation since the end of World War I. During World War, which of course started or was kicked off in Sarajevo by a Serbian assassin of a German-speaking Austrian heir apparent, Archduke. And so there were these historical resonances and kind of reasons that German policy was anti-Serbian, and Serbian nationalists also viewed Germany as this perennial enemy of the Serbs. And so the breakup of Yugoslavia followed these two kind of ideas: to punish the Serbs and to create a large entity that would guarantee the stability of this region. So in order to punish the Serbs, we have, if you look at the map in the kind of eastern part of the country, there is this entity that's labeled here Serbian Residual State. That's basically the kind of traditional regions of Serbia proper today that were put under direct German occupation. Basically, Hitler didn't trust the Serbs to bear arms. There were hundreds of thousands of Serbian soldiers from the Yugoslav army that were shipped off to POW camps in Germany. And there was no military force, no even police force. The Germans directly occupied Serbia. This was to change a little bit later, but in name only. Later there was a collaborationist government and some provisional kind of in name only police and kind of units under arms, but nothing necessary to even police, let alone to provide military security. And then to the west of this Serbia, of the German occupation, was this large new entity called the Independent State of Croatia, which encompassed most of what today are Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, minus the larger part of Dalmatia, the kind of Adriatic coast, which the Italians considered properly Italian, and which they occupied and annexed. So if you look at the areas on the the Eastern Adriatic, the kind of littoral, you can see that these areas were annexed to Italy, as well as the province of Ljubljana, as they say, what today is Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia. It came under Italian administration. Some other parts of Slovenia were annexed to Germany, to the Reich. To the administrative units today in Austria, but that were part of the Third Reich. And then some parts were then also given to the other allies of the Third Reich, to Hungary and Bulgaria. Hungary occupied what today is Bachka, also part of Serbia, and part of Croatia and Slovenia in the north, and basically instituted its administration in those areas. And Bulgaria occupied parts of eastern Serbia and Kosovo and what today is the Republic of Northern Macedonia. So basically, after the attack of April 6th, and after 11 days of failed, defense, Yugoslavia ceased to exist and became this hodgepodge of territories, whether they were under direct German occupation, or nominally independent, as the state, the name of the independent state of Croatia implied. And let me just say a few more words about the independent state of Croatia, because it's important, I think, for our later understanding of what we will talk about. I said that Hitler wanted to appease or placate the traditional enemies of Yugoslavia. And because of those kind of grievances and interwar tensions that I mentioned earlier, Croats as a nation became a natural ally in this. If you recognize Croatian grievances against Yugoslavia and create a Croatian state, the idea went, you would be able to get long-term loyalty of this new state. It can be your ally, and it can protect security in the Balkans, especially since there is another part of the former country that's directly east of this that's controlled by the German occupation forces. So Hitler decided to create this new entity called the Independent State of Croatia out of territories of Croatia and Bosnia, after giving some territory to Italy. And he offered the leadership of this new country to the leader of the largest interwar Croatian opposition party, Vlatko Maček, who was a Republican and who was there were debates whether he wanted a confederation within the Yugoslav state, or whether he was a true Yugoslav. There were all these different notions about him, but the point is he refused. He was an anti-fascist. He was against Hitler. He didn't want this role, and he refused this offer. Only after which this new leadership position was offered to this marginalized group of fascists that became leaders of this state, and we can talk about that a little later. And one more thing that I need to talk about here is and you can see this in the map. I'm sorry, there's no better way to represent this, but if you look at the independent state of Croatia, you will see that the northern part and the southern part are colored differently, that there is a kind of line of demarcation that goes from Zagreb in the northwest via Banja Luka and Sarajevo towards the southeast. North of this line was the German zone of the independent state of Croatia, and south of this line was the Italian zone of the independent state of Croatia. This might sound very technical for now, but I just wanted to show you this because the dynamic of the war was in many ways determined by these different areas of control. And while the Ustaše, the rulers of the independent state of Croatia, were nominally independent, there were German troops permanently stationed in the northern part and Italian troops permanently stationed in the southern part, and German troops getting into the southern part at will as well. But so the new rulers of this nominally independent state were anything but independent.
Thanks for that. That's there's so much complexity in this, and I think for a lot of Americans, what they may know about any of this is the Luftwaffe bombing Belgrade. I think some people remember how savage and the casualties that were inflicted from that. But you're taking us into material that's really crucial for understanding this history, but is much less familiar about who was where, how this country was really partitioned. And now we get into, since the title of this is between partisan war and genocide, we get into some of the systematic mass violence that follows the partitioning of the country. So you could really say here the aftermath of Yugoslavia's fall is marked by horrific ethno-nationalist violence. Here we want to start with that of the Croatian fascist Ustasha. You've just mentioned them, of Ante Pavelic against Serbs, but later also against Jews and Roma, and also anti-Muslim violence carried out by Serbs. So, Emil, I know this is a lot here, but could you take us through what occurred?
Yes, very gladly. Jan, if I can ask you to remove the map for now. So I think an important thing to know here is that, as I said, Pavelic's Ustasha movement was not the first choice for Hitler. Hitler needed stability. Hitler chose an established Croatian politician with unmatched, almost total, not control, but allegiance of the Croatian nation. And then he refused. So at that point, Hitler turned to Pavelic. And Ante Pavelic was a lawyer in the interwar period. He basically led this radical Croatian nationalist fringe movement, which was fueled by the turmoil in Yugoslavia, and of the political turmoil that I mentioned earlier. The stated goals of the Ustasha movement were the destruction of Yugoslavia and the formation of an independent Croat national state in the ethnic regions of Croatia, as they said, meaning on as much territory as possible in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then the purge of this society or the new country of all the undesirable elements. And here they mixed kind of racial, racist kind of discourse with purely anti-Serbian animus. Their goal, their sites were trained almost exclusively in the interwar period on the Serbs. The Serbs were seen as the most despised enemy of both the Croat people and the prospects for the Croat state. They were seen as beneficiaries of Yugoslavia and as a body within the Croatian nation that will always be loyal to Yugoslavia and not to Croatia. And so their goal was to purge the Serbs from the Croatian ethnic territory, whatever that means. They were also against Roma on unsurprising racist kind of fascist grounds, that idea that circulated in Europe at the time. And so when they finally gain power, and they gain power because Hitler takes them rather unceremoniously overnight, ferries them back from Italy into Yugoslavia. They were exiles in the interwar period. They were banned and persecuted, and most of the Croatian leadership and membership was in exile and training in camps in Hungary and Italy, and so on April 10th, when the independent state of Croatia is proclaimed in Zagreb, Pavelić is not even in the country. He has yet to be ferried basically by bus over land for a trip that took a day or so. And then he is now this new leader, and they immediately styled themselves as a fascist state. He became the leader, the Poglavnik, a title similar to Führer, like the leader. This new Croatian state nominally had the parliament, but there'd never be ever any elections in this country. And the other kind of issue that they had to deal with is that it was now, this dream come true. We have an independent Croat state, but in this independent Croat state, barely 50% of the population is what you could call Croat, that is Catholic. And now this is complex. I don't have time to get into the religious issues here. There were about 50% of this new state were Roman Catholics. About 1/3, 35% were Orthodox Serbs, and a large number, probably over about 25%, Bosnian Muslims, with some other Roma, Jews, and so on in small numbers. So this country didn't even have a clear ethnic majority, even though they proclaimed that this was a Croat state, that they were a avant-garde of the Croat national movement, and that they're going to purge everyone else. So that was a daunting task. And immediately as they seize power in 1941, they institute these discriminatory laws, primarily against Serbs and Jews, and also Roma, on different grounds. On Jews and Roma, these were purely racial laws. And for the Serbs, it was about being either a descendant of people who had migrated to Croatia after 1918, or who were Orthodox Serbs. But more importantly than those discriminatory laws, they resorted almost immediately in the spring of 1941 to genocidal violence, to wanton kind of random mass killing of civilians, either in villages in Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, or by rounding up prominent Serbs and Jews and of course in the countryside there were mostly Serbs. There were no or very few Jews in the countryside. The Jews were concentrated in the cities. So in the cities they rounded up um, Jews and prominent Jews and Serbs. In the countryside, they started killing Serb civilians en masse. They would come to the village, murder everyone, women, children, the elderly, burn the village. By the end of 1941, they had already killed about 100,000 Serbs in this realm. So in like 7 or 8 months. Um, and they had already organized ad hoc camps to which they deported the enemies of the regime and mostly Serbs, prominent Serbs and prominent Jews. This then affected the basically the countryside became ungovernable because once the people started, once stories started circulating about what's happening, a lot of Serbs and whoever could grab some kind of weapon and leave their village and go into the woods or onto the mountain and try to survive. A lot of people did so and organized against the Ustasha marauders and killers. So they a lot of this countryside becomes ungovernable and kind of uncontrolled violence and insecurity in the country. A lot of Serbian civilians also fled, crossed the river that's called the Drina that separates Bosnia from Serbia, at that time German occupied Serbia, and came as refugees to Serbia because they found this to be a safe place for them. But the point is that this radicalization and this ethnic this horrible violence, and I will talk about the violence against the Muslims a little later. You're right, there was genocidal violence that the Serbs perpetrated mostly in Bosnia and Herzegovina against Bosnian Muslim civilians. And I will contextualize this later when we talk about Mihailovic and the Chetniks. But this kind of descent into chaos was very important for the development of the war, and connected to this, the dynamic of anti-Jewish persecution and the partisan warfare, which we will talk about later. Yes, I hope this answers the question.
Oh, thank you. I know it's such difficult material, and I know accounts. I can recall when I read Saul Friedlander's The Years of Extermination, his history of the Holocaust, and he had all this documentation about the killing of. He also, of course, did take on the issue about anti-Serb violence carried out by the Ustasha, and it's just unbelievable, or maybe not so unbelievable when you think about these larger kind of patterns of systematic violence. But it's interesting that we're seeing this in the spring and the summer of 1941, so early, and will overlap with things happening in the Soviet Union, um, at least in time. So these are things we can all, I think, come back to later on. But you've already noted camps, Emil, and I thought that would take me then to bring in Jasenovac concentration camp. which has come to symbolize many of the terrors perpetrated by the Ustasha. So, could you, for our audience, describe this place of horror and give us some sense about why it has become a symbol?
Yes. Jan, if you could give us a slide with that black and white photograph of Jasenovac's camp. Yes, thank you. Um, I mentioned the formation of early camps to which during the late spring and summer of 1941, um, Serbs and Jews were taken to and killed in most savage ways. There were camps in more notorious camps were or basically they were not even camps, they were murder sites. One was in the on Mount Velebit in Dalmatia, where basically civilians would be killed and thrown into karst pits that were endemic in this region, kind of natural mass graves. And another one was on the island of Pag, a very inhospitable kind of area where people would be brought and either be killed immediately or starved to death from exposure, hunger, and die very soon afterwards. But this is where, when we talk about the Yasenovas, this is also why, and immediately why this kind of fact that I highlighted when we looked at the map of Yugoslavia and the division of the independent state of Croatia into Italian and German zones becomes very important. So, because of the chaos that I mentioned that ruled in the spring and summer of 1942 in the independent state of Croatia, that of course was absolutely against what and the opposite of what Hitler wanted. He wanted peace and security, and he got random violence and chaos and ungovernable space, which of course was then rife with people who were opposed to Germany, with resistance fighters. So both the Italians and the Germans were frustrated with this Ustasha excesses. And by the fall of 1941, the Italians had basically pushed all Ustasha units out of their zone of control. So half of the independent state of Croatia became inaccessible, more or less, to the Ustasha, to the leaders of this nominally independent state. There were some administrative, offices and outposts, but in terms of security and military control, there was no question. This was now Italian territory. And north of this line, the Germans took over the security control. And so because these initial camps that I mentioned, the one on the island of Pag and one on Mount Velebit, were in Dalmatia and northern Adriatic, which were under Italian control, they became inaccessible now for the Ustasha and became not good sites for camps. So in the fall of 1941, the Ustasha found a new camp, which is about 100 kilometers southeast of Zagreb, in the German area of control, near the village of Jasenovac, with a convenient train track that leads to Zagreb. This was the site of a pre-war Serbian-owned factory they took over and built a concentration camp around this new factory. Jasenovac became a camp that opened, I hate this expression, opened its doors. It was a place where they deported hundreds of thousands of people, primarily Serbs, but also Jews and all other, communists or other kinds of anti-fascists or political opponents. And over the years, from its founding in 1941 until liberation in the spring of 1945, in May of 1945, as it was liberated after the fall of Berlin, basically. Some 100,000 people were killed or otherwise died in the camp. It wasn't an extermination camp in the sense Birkenau was, being the place that was made exclusively to kill and dispose of hundreds of thousands of humans and their bodies. But it was, in all other sense of the word, a death camp. It was a camp where disregard for human life, casual cruelty and mistreatment, exposure to the elements, starvation, took the lives of about 100,000 people. The guards, the Ustasha guards in this camp were especially cruel, and the stories that a few survivors tell are horrific. And most of the victims of Jasenovac were Serbs. About half, just over a half of that 100,000 victims were Serbs. For being Serb, that was their crime. And then a large number of Jews, about 17,000 Jews, and then thousands of Roma. Basically, the entire population, the entire Roma population of what is today Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina perished in this camp. And other enemies of the regime were also persecuted there. It became this horrific metonymic place that signifies the kind of wartime suffering in Yugoslavia, and was for a long time, even during the communist rule in Yugoslavia, was kind of a place and a site that was not easy to domesticate, because that was the communists after the war wanted to build a country and kind of forge this narrative that the Yugoslav people stood together in brotherhood and unity, as the phrase went, against the occupiers. But Jasenovac was a camp founded and run by Yugoslavs, by former Yugoslavs, by the Croatian Ustasha, to kill other former Yugoslavs. It was a very difficult story to kind of process and to ideologically domesticate. So it was a problematic kind of side of memory even during communist Yugoslavia. And then in the 1990s, as Yugoslavia was breaking up, it became a major site of historical revisionism, from Serbian nationalists claiming that 1 million Serbs were killed there. It was a Croatian Auschwitz. And then from on the other side, people completely negating its existence or minimizing and relativizing its role, including the first democratically elected president of Croatia, Franjo Tudjman, who was elected in 1990. So, and to this day, it's a very kind of controversial site, even though for historians there is really no controversy. Like if you are a decent historian and not a propagandist, it's very easy to understand what happened in Jasenovac.
Thank you for this. That I certainly knew about it being a kind of embattled space even to this day, but all that information really assists us in knowing what happened and who was primarily targeted and the numbers, 100,000 people perishing there. It'll be one of those things I think people who see this webinar will remember the name Jasenovac. They may not remember other things from the webinar, but I think this will be one of those things that sticks, with
Let me
them.
just add one thing I
Please.
just realized. We should also know that this was the largest camp in wartime Europe that was run by not by Germans but by their allies. I think that's important. The other thing I wanted to say is this is one of the rare photographs that we do have of Jasenovac. This is from late 1941 or early 1942. That's the only picture we have. There is a propaganda film done by Ustaše in 1943, which shows some parts of the camp, but this was a propaganda film. There was perpetrator, document, and is problematic. And then in May 1945, the Ustaše dynamited everything, and the entire camp was destroyed. And much of this, materials that were left over, like bricks and stone and things like that, mortar, were used to rebuild the village later. So it's an eerie story also, how like the materiality of this camp still lives somehow in the area around it.
So this is such important material, and I think the just processing this notion that you have a camp like this operating where there are no Nazi personnel or uh, who are directly involved in this, but gives some sense about just how brutal the Ustasha regime was. And so now, we can get into the issue about who's resisting them and the occupation forces of fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, etc. And here we have to talk about two resistance movements emerging to challenge the occupation and partitioning of Yugoslavia. The communist movement of Josip Broz, or Tito, that's everyone remembers him, and the Chetniks of Dragoljub Mihailovic, a Serbian nationalist movement. So could you talk about the emergence of these movements in this early phase of anti-Axis resistance?
Yes, Jan, if we can remove the picture now. I should begin, thank you. I should begin by saying, and you're right, there were two poles in 1941 from which there was some initial resistance against the German occupation. But I think it's misleading a little bit to talk about two resistance movements. And certainly when we look at the history of World War II in Yugoslavia in its totality, and I will explain why. Today, this is the two, the phrase two resistance movements is somehow, it's normalized today in Serbia in order to rehabilitate the Chetniks as portraying them as this anti-fascist, resistance movement, whereas they were a proto-fascist kind of exterminationist movement. But yes, they did initially oppose the Germans. But I will talk you through this so we can understand why. What I wanted to say is just that this notion that there were two resistance movements has very pronounced political valence today, and I try to avoid saying it, the phrase itself. But yes, there were two kind of poles of initial resistance. One was led by the Yugoslav army colonel Dragoljub Mihailovic, who simply refused to recognize the defeat of Yugoslavia, didn't surrender in April of 1941, went to the mountains of Western Serbia, and gathered around himself other like-minded officers and soldiers who escaped captivity, to organize a resistance movement. That was the goal, to resist the occupation and to coordinate this action with the Western allies. That was the initial goal. And that sounds great. That sounds very lofty. That sounds very, resistance-y. But on the other hand, they were also a movement underpinned by a very virulent, bordering on exterminationist Serbian nationalism. There was this resentment in this movement about the collapse of Yugoslavia. Mihailovic and others in his group were quick to blame the Croats, the Muslims, all the non-Serbian populations of Yugoslavia as not really fighting for Yugoslavia, as just waiting for the Germans to take the country over, to get their nationalist dreams fulfilled by the Germans, and by betraying the country and betraying the Serbs. And especially after the horrific Serbian casualties in World War I. We should note that about a third of Serbian male population was killed in World War I. The horrific demographic losses that the Serbs carried into Yugoslavia. And now the argument went, we were betrayed by these freeloaders who just saw Yugoslavia as a transitional state towards their own greater Croatia, or the Muslim nationalists, and so on. And so, apart from resisting the Germans, which was the kind of first idea, the other idea, and the increase as the time goes on, it's increasingly becoming more important, is to create the situation on the ground that will allow for a creation of a greater Serbian state on the ruins of Yugoslavia after the war. So presumably after the war, when the Allies win, and Mihailovic always believed that the British will win, they will sanction this new Serbian state created by their allies, the Chetniks, right? And so they engaged in very unsavory kind of genocidal actions against primarily Bosnian Muslims in Eastern Bosnia and Eastern Herzegovina, as the kind of chaos of the summer of 41 encompassed the independent state of Croatia. It was a fertile ground for the Chetniks to recruit Serbian peasants who lost everything, whose families were killed, and to seek revenge on Muslim civilians. So in 1941, in 1942, 43, the forces nominally tied to Mihailovic committed war crimes and genocidal violence against Muslim civilians. Thousands of women, children, the elderly, no, quarter to anyone. Entire villages burned and so on. So that's important when we are talking about the Chetniks, is that and these troops under Mihailovich, is that they were focused on ethnic cleansing and the creation of cleansed ethnic space that would be Serbian after the war, and that would allow a future Serbian state to carve out territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina to be part of that future Serbian state. The second part of the kind of unsavory behavior of this quote unquote resistance movement is that as the time went on, it basically stopped even talking about resistance. They understood as the war progressed that the communists, led by Tito, and I will talk about them in a second, were a far greater danger to the Chetniks and their project of a greater Serbian state than the Germans, who were going to be defeated anyway. So they stopped fighting the Germans. They even coordinated their actions with the Germans and the Italians against the Tito's communists. And Mihailovich even put units under command of his generals under German command officially. So they officially collaborated and took orders from the Germans. So while yes, there were these initial notions that this was a resistance movement, they were basically collaborating with the Germans, committing major crimes against fellow Yugoslavs, and fighting the other movement that was of note. And that movement, and I will ask Jan now there's a picture of a review of a ragtag communist military unit that I want to show. Yes, exactly. The other resistance movement was basically led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia under the leadership of Josip Broz, who was known as Tito. And here you can see him in the center of the kind of this reviewing posse here with the black hat and the kind of tan light overcoat. He's reviewing this is the first proletarian brigade. That's one of the first elite units of Tito's communist army. And this is in Eastern Bosnia in early 1942. This is one of the first real units of large elite units of his army. And you can tell by the uniforms, there is no uniform. There's no uni in the uniform. Everyone's different. They're wearing Italian, old Serbian uniforms, all kinds of things. But this is the first proletarian brigade. And Tito was a very experienced kind of underground leader of an underground party. The Communist Party in Yugoslavia was outlawed in 1921. So for the entire period, Tito became the general secretary of the party in 1937. He was sent by Stalin from Moscow. He was a Stalin cadre who was sent from Moscow to organize the Communist Party in Yugoslavia and to kind of into a like battle-ready, lean political and paramilitary force, and he was successful. And so in 1941, with the collapse of Yugoslavia, Tito moves from Zagreb, where he was the central committee was in Zagreb. He moves to Belgrade, and in July of 1941, after Germany invades the Soviet Union, calls for the uprising of the Yugoslav peoples against the Germans and other occupiers of Yugoslavia. And so throughout the summer of and early fall of 1941, there's this full-scale uprising that's very in the German occupied Serbia, that's very difficult to arrest and to stop. It's fueled by this wide anti-German sentiment. It's fueled by these radicalized refugees that are coming across the river from the independent state of Croatia. Hundreds of thousands of refugees flooding into Serbia with stories of terror and kind of radicalizing the population. And so both initially this movement of Mihailovic and the movement led by the Communist Party become they are very successful in mobilizing anti-German people who wanted to fight and who were ready to resist. By the fall of 1941, they even collaborate. They work together against the Germans, but then, excuse me, the communists basically take over this large territory in Western Serbia. They liberate the territory. There are no more German troops. There's cities and villages, and it's something that's unprecedented in Hitler's Europe. They even jumpstart a pre-war munitions factory. They start making weapons. And then this is also when the Chetniks and Mihailovic also realizes that they are the bigger problem for him and his Serbian nationalist program than the Germans themselves. And so from that time, he starts collaborating with the Germans against the communists. And so with Chetnik help, the Germans managed to evict the communists from that liberated area and from Serbia proper into Bosnia and Herzegovina, where the rest and most of World War II in Yugoslavia was fought. I think, yeah, I think that it's a good story about the two movements, right?
It is a good start, and the corrective about these as two resistance movements is most welcome. We certainly don't want to do anything to minimize fascist tendencies or proto-fascist tendencies here, and we'll have a lot more to say about Tito in later questions and about
Yeah.
why the communist partisans are so successful in Yugoslavia. But now I think we've set up for the audience a lot. We've seen kind of who many of the major um, players are in the country after April 1941. Um, so what I'd like to come to now is talking about the mass murder of Jews executed by the Germans. Um, so with this question, Emil, I wanted to ask you about where does Yugoslavia fit, you think, in the way we understand the origins of the Holocaust? And since this is titled Between Partisan War and Genocide, how did anti-partisan warfare and the mass annihilation of Jews intertwine in Yugoslavia?
Um, yes, that's a great question. And Jan, if we can remove the image now, thank you. Um, it's a great question. I think it's very important. Like you said that you defined the Holocaust as the mass murder of Jews perpetrated by the Germans, and even by this definition, Yugoslavia has a very important role and place in this history and timeline of the Holocaust, and I will talk about this in a minute. But I want to stress, I want to make two general observations before I get into this timeline, because I think it'll be clearer to our audience. One is that pace, dynamic, and twists and turns of the Holocaust timeline in Europe depended on Germany. There would have been no Holocaust without the war. And genocide was not immediately the goal of the Nazi leadership. The Nazis' goal was to remove the Jews from their society. When they seized power in 1933, they tried this by many different means. They outlawed the Jews. They tried to make their lives miserable so that they would emigrate. Large numbers of Jews emigrated. And so it was tried in different ways. Genocide was not always. It was not immediately the kind of clear that this was going to become the so-called solution to the so-called Jewish question. And then the other observation I wanted to make is that once the genocide was underway, that was after the invasion of the Soviet Union and the mass killings by Sonderkommandos in behind the front line of Jews and communists. The fate of the Jews in the areas directly controlled by the Germans was sealed. This became the German political priority, and so they mobilized their resources towards genocide. But in areas in which they only had indirect control, in the countries who were their allies, but who might not have put and could have even been anti-Semitic, but did not put the removal of the murder of the Jews as like priority number one on their agenda. The genocide was only as successful as the reach and the pressure of the Germans was successful. And that reach and that pressure and that even soft power or the kind of possibility and the ability to persuade tended to go down as the war progressed and as it became increasingly clear that Germany was going to lose the war. So I think this is important to keep in mind, and I will, maybe if we have time, I can give you some examples of this, but there are examples directly related to Yugoslavia as well. So Serbia was occupied by the Germans. And so when the Holocaust, when the genocide against the Jews became priority for the Germans, it happened pretty fast in Serbia because it was one of the places where there are few Jews, and that was a small territory and logistically not that problematic. But it was intertwined, like this whole kind of timeline of genocide was intertwined with the history of the uprising in Serbia. As I said, by the summer and fall of 1941, Serbia was experiencing a significant uprising, and kind of Germans had troubles kind of dealing with it. And in the fall of 1941, they opted for to implement harsh punitive measures against civilians. They would take hostages and kill 100 civilians for every dead German soldier and 50 civilians for every wounded German soldier. In the fall of 1941, this led to incredible, harrowing massacres. Just over 2 days in October 1941 in Kragujevac and Kraljevo, they executed about 5,000 people, hostages rounded up, including high school students, randomly picked from a high school in the middle of class. so they started with these horrific reprisals that were coming, becoming further radicalizing basically the population. And then they realized that they could still keep these quotas, but perhaps alienate the population less if they, instead of just random civilians, they started shooting mostly Jews and Roma. And Roma were easy to round up and bring to for execution. And Jewish men were all registered since April, since the initial German anti-Semitic measures. They had to register with the Germans. They were, the Germans knew where they were and just could get them very easily. So by the end of 1941, the practically all Serbian men above the age of 15 or 16 were killed already in these shootings, reprisal shootings. These were thousands of people. And then in December of 1941, the Germans decided to put the remaining Jews, mostly women, children, and the elderly, people who were not shot, as hostages, basically the other half of the population, of the Jewish population, into a camp that was specifically called the Jewish camp. It was Camp for the Jews, and it was located across the Sava River from Belgrade, but in full view of the city of Belgrade. You could walk in downtown Belgrade and look across the river and see the camp where the Jews were kept. Now, this is December 1941. This is the key time in the history of the Holocaust, in the sense when this genocidal consensus in the Nazi leadership solidifies, that we're not just randomly going to kill Jews and treat them harshly and hope they will disappear on their own. We will commit genocide and mobilize state resources to do that. And this was, consequence of many different factors. One of them is because German soldiers were shooting Jewish civilians by the tens and hundreds of thousands in the Soviet Union. This was a very messy process that resulted in alcoholism and lowering the morale and people going crazy and not being able to effectively wage war. And so in the fall of 1941, the Germans started experimenting with other methods of mass killing, one of which is with gas. And they try in Helmno in Poland, there is this site where they start experimenting killing people in a gas van. It's a sealed van where you would put people in the back of the van, disconnect the exhaust pipe and reconnect it with the cabin in the back, and basically kill people by carbon monoxide inside. This was tried in Helmno in November and December of 1941. In 1942, early 1942, in January, there is the infamous Wannsee Conference, where the Nazi leadership meets in a suburban villa in Berlin with all the kind of stakeholders, we would say today, of the German Empire. And decides to basically kill as many to commit genocide against the Jews, start Operation Reinhard, open killing centers with gas chambers in Poland and kill the Jews there. So that's happening around the same time when the hostages in Serbia, the Jewish hostages, are being exterminated in reprisal shootings, and now this question what to do with women and children, and the local German leadership in Belgrade asks Berlin to send a gas van because they're aware of these experiments elsewhere in Europe. And the Berlin obliges, and in February or February of 1942, the gas van arrives in Belgrade in this Jewish camp, and then by the end of May, by late spring of 1942, Germans killed the remaining between 5,000 and 6,000 Jews who were in this camp. And so the marking of the transition in the genocide against the Jews from what today we call Holocaust by bullets to Holocaust by gas is very kind of the Belgrade is one of the kind of key milestones in this timeline. It is the kind of breaking point of the genocide and the kind of foray into murders by gas. It's not as obviously famous as Auschwitz and Treblinka, which were killing centers built with gas chambers specifically to kill. I mean, when I say Auschwitz, I mean Birkenau specifically. Places with gas chambers to kill large number of people and built specifically for this purpose. But Belgrade and this Jewish camp in Belgrade is a transition to that, and as such, it has a very important part in this history. Other Jews in Yugoslavia were not under German control. They were under control of the Ustasha, they were under control of the Hungarians, they were under control of the Bulgarians. And this, again, was, as I said, the dynamic of their fate was contingent upon the German ability to persuade their allies to deliver Jews, to extradite them to Germany, to deport them to Poland, or to kill them in situ in their own places. The Ustasha government complied and sent their Jews to Auschwitz after this initial Jasenovac killing that continued with the Serbs and others. The Italians, however, in the Italian zone, refused to do that and repeated, pressure of the Germans to deport the Jews were basically rebuffed. And that's why most of the Jews who survived in Yugoslavia survived either as members of Tito's partisan movement or in the Italian zone of occupation, and usually both, and as we can talk about later. And then in Bulgaria, also parts of Macedonia and Serbia were occupied by Bulgaria in March of 1943. The Bulgarian government basically deported all the Jews from these regions to Treblinka under German pressure. But only few months later, in the summer of 1943, when it kind of was obvious that, with the American landing in Sicily and the kind of battle done already in North Africa and the talks about the landing in Europe elsewhere of the Allies, and it was becoming clear that and after Stalingrad, of course, that Germany was going to lose the war, the Bulgaria refused to deport the rest of its Jews to Germany. And that's why we have this kind of myth of the saving of Bulgarian Jews. It was not the saving, because some of the Jews were deported to their death. The same state that deported these Jews decided that they were not going to deport the rest. And usually the reasons for these kind of policy decisions, and in the Italian case as well, was that these were bargaining chips through which these governments could negotiate their relationship both to the waning Hitler's power and also to the allies, saying, oh, but we saved our Jews, we are hoping after the war that this was going to be looked upon favorably, and that this is a chip in our favor for our post-war position in Europe. So in that sense, the history of the genocide against the Jews in Yugoslavia was very uneven.
I think the fact that you brought up, the case of Bulgaria too, this Bulgarian zone, what happens to Jews there, a figure like the one of Adolf Eichmann's subordinates, Theodor Doniker, who's heavily involved I think we would term him like a deportation specialist. I mean,
Yes.
he moves all over the continent and organizes deportations of Jewish communities to the extermination camps in Poland, and that is a part of this history that we are kind of working through together. And you noted that Jews do survive, and there's this maybe surprising for our audience case of fascist Italy's areas where Jews are not turned over while they're in control of occupation. And then there are the cases of those who are with Tito. And you documented a pretty extraordinary action, a rescue of Jews carried out by communist partisans on Robb Island in the Adriatic in the fall of 1943. Well, I think this is a story that our viewers should really know something about. So, could you narrate this operation for us?
Absolutely. So again, here we need to keep in mind the division of the independent state of Croatia into the Italian zone and the German zone. And after, as I said, after the chaos of the spring and summer of 1941, the Italian zone of the independent state of Croatia, the littoral, the kind of coast, the Adriatic coast, and its hinterland becomes an area that's kind of a refuge for the Jews, because even though there are anti-Jewish laws in Italy and even in the occupied territories, it's not, they're not an automatic death sentence, and the Italians were loath to deliver the Jews to the Germans, and that has to do less with the goodness of the fascist hearts than with the kind of negotiation of their relationship with Berlin. The fascists always had this complex of inferiority when they were dealing with Berlin and as a senior partner, and kind of wanted to pull the strings that they could in order to assert their own supposed autonomy and independence of their policy. And there's excellent scholarship on Italian anti-Semitism, fascism, and so on, and policy against the Jews that kind of grapples and kind of shows that this is really a myth, that because Italians were not anti-Semitic, that they wanted to save the Jews. No, this was a cold-blooded realpolitik kind of action. But the fact is that they did refuse there were repeated German entreaties and kind of invitations to the Italian occupation forces to deliver the Jews to either the Croats or to deport them to Germany, and to allow the Germans to deal with those Jews, to kill them. And the Italians refused, and so because of that, these areas became desirable for the Jews throughout the former Yugoslavia, and a lot of people managed to flee to this territory in nominally in the independent state of Croatia, but really under Italian occupation. This is not to say that the Italian occupation was lenient. The Italians enrolled Mihailovic's Chetniks as a way of controlling the countryside in the independent state of Croatia. So, and the Chetniks were they were Serbian nationalists, and they were creating, as I said, ethnically cleansed Serbian territory, but they were also fiercely anti-communist. That was their main kind of enemy. So a lot of communists and communist sympathizers, or even people who were accused of being communist sympathizers, were mercilessly killed and detained in camps in the Italian zone of occupation. And Jews themselves were also detained in camps, in several camps along the coast. And then in the spring of 1943, as the German pressure becomes almost unbearable, the Italians decide to transfer all the Jewish population from all the camps in the Italian zone to the island of Rab, or Arbe in Italian. The gesture and the kind of political move is important because Rab was not an occupied zone. Rab was Italy proper. It was Italian territory. It was in the Eastern Adriatic. Today, it's an island, a wonderful, beautiful tourist island in Croatia. But at the time, it was part of the Italian kingdom. And so all this pressure of the Germans to basically deport the Jews from the occupation zone became moot, because there were no more Jews in the Italian occupation zone, and there were Jews in Italy, and they're now these people in Rab, in the camp, were treated like all other Jews in Italy, and this was a much larger problem now for the Germans. Now, this was all great for the Jews. They were still in a camp, in a very vicious camp. It was basically a sub camp of a larger camp, where Yugoslav communists and anti-fascists, mostly from Slovenia, were kept under much worse conditions. There were bestial murder of communists in the Slovenian part of the camp, whereas in the Jewish part of the camp, the conditions were more or less tolerable. It wasn't great, but there was enough food, and it was peaceful. And then in September of 1943, basically 4 months after they are transferred to Rab, and we're talking about between 2,500 and 3,000 people, Jews. Italy basically collapses. The Italian government collapses. The Americans are pushing from the south. Mussolini is arrested. The areas north of the front that's being pushed by American troops is reoccupied by German troops. And now, suddenly, overnight, these Jews and others in the camp their position become precarious. They are now subject to the German rule, not to the Italian rule anymore, which in the case of the Jews, of course, means certain death. It's just a matter of time when the Germans are going to come and deport them to wherever, Auschwitz, Treblinka, wherever. And so, and Jan, if we can have, there is a picture of, yes, this is for months in the Jewish part of the camp, there is political organizing. There is a communist cell in the among the Jews in the both in the Slovenian and the Jewish part of the camp. And the Jews, the kind of men Jewish men who are inclined to do so, and most by that time had communist sympathies, decide to create a Jewish battalion that at the time of the liberation of the camp would join Tito's army and become part of the national liberation movement of Yugoslavia. And this picture here was taken by one of the Jewish inmates in the camp, Elvira Kohn, who smuggled a photo camera when she was transferred from her camp in Dubrovnik to Kupari to Rab, and documented the kind of end of the Rab concentration camp. And this is the Jewish battalion with the flag of the Yugoslav liberation movement, marching through this town on the island, Kampor, where adjacent to the camp and ready to join the partisan army. At the same time, the communist cell established the connection to the partisan units on the mainland. And over several weeks from then on, the Yugoslav partisan evacuate all the Jews and Slovenes, but we're talking about the Jews here, all the Jews from the island into the liberated territory in the independent state of Croatia. They control this territory in the mountains south of Zagreb, and they basically, under bombardment and heavy fire by the Germans, managed to transfer thousands of people into the hinterland. And then in the hinterland, they organized care for them. There is an ad hoc office for the care of refugee Jews. That was the official title of this partisan communist commission that assigned people housing and food distribution, and then they also mobilize the men to become fighters for the national liberation movement, the Tito's communist army. The Jews had hoped that they would join the partisans as its own unit, but this was against the ideology of the communists. The communists didn't organize their units on ethnic belonging. They were regional units, and so the Jews were distributed into several different brigades and battalions. But the main point is that these people survived. About 2,500 Jews survived who were who had been incarcerated in this concentration camp, and most became fighters in Tito's army, and kind of took steps to liberate Yugoslavia as well. And this is one of the least known kinds of episodes of rescue during the Holocaust, that I think is worth mentioning.
I think it's worth mentioning too. Well, like I think it's a quite really an incredible moment, and your article alludes to the fact that the communist partisans would have rejected the term rescue or themselves as rescuers, that there was a sense of anti-fascist solidarity among peoples, which you note in the article, a sense of they wanted a kind of federated Yugoslavia where all of the peoples of the former Yugoslavia would be kind of brought together. At least the rhetoric of it, and we'll come back to this in the final question. The rhetoric of it was democratic. Obviously, some socialist or communist vision of democracy, but at least that was the formal rhetoric of it at the time. And it's amazing when you think about you mentioned their German aircraft strafing them as they're carrying out the operation and the like. So we'll say more about the partisans here in fact these last two or three questions. But I guess we should resolve one thing first, Emil, which is Mihailovich and Tito. And this is something I think for our audience about the fact many of them may be aware of this, that the Allies will turn against Mihailovich as the war wears on and more toward Tito. So could you just say something, maybe kind of resolving this, since it's been a theme throughout the webinar so far, and how did the Allies aid Tito once they begin to turn towards him? You're still on mute. Yeah.
This is a very important story. It's important also to understand that Mihailovich had an advantage over Tito in the sense that he was an officer of an army of a nominally democratic state that had its government in exile, in theory functioning in London. The prime minister and the government fled the country, and even though the army was defeated, there was kind of, a government in exile. And the Allies were getting the news about the developments in Yugoslavia through the government in exile, which was, of course, through Mihailovich's eyes and his ideological filters and his interests. He was free to, exaggerate and omit and misrepresent and so on what was going on. And until the Allies started sending their own missions attached to the partisans, not only to Mihailovich's Chetniks, but to the partisans. And until they realized that it is really the partisans who are fighting the Germans and not the Chetniks, and the Chetniks are really collaborating. That's the first part of the, equation. The partisans are the real resistance force in Yugoslavia. It's not the Chetniks, it's the partisans. We need to support real resistance, number one. And number two, it looks like the partisans are going to triumph whether we support them or not. And so we better support them so that we have some leverage with them after the war. And so those were the reasons why in the summer of 1943, Churchill, and then later the US. Stalin had always been supporting the partisans, but he could not give them any material aid because he was fighting his own war and was on the defensive until 43. And so the British and then the Americans start supporting the partisans, and they support them mostly by airdropping supplies, the weapons and materials, and by acting as air cover. They're bombing strategic targets. They are even at one point evacuating the entire leadership of the Yugoslav Central Committee, including Tito, from a pickle in the town of Drvar in 1944 when the Germans launched their final assault and tried to assassinate Tito. They're evacuated barely, but thankfully evacuated to by British Air Force to the island of Vis, which then is in the middle of the Adriatic under British air protection and becomes the general staff and the seat of Tito's movement until Belgrade is liberated, and then they move to Belgrade. So yeah, that's pretty much the story. The Allies realized that the Tito's movement is the one that's really resisting, and that it's in their interest to support them.
It's just interesting, when you think about the fact that by this point in the war, you're mentioning like 1943, 44, the Allies, of course, are pushing up the Italian peninsula, um, and there's a big partisan movement in Albania. There's the partisan movement in Greece. So the whole area, really, I mean, there's just enormous armed resistance will be in northern Italy, against both the Germans and pro-Mussolini Italians. So it's a really remarkable moment in the history of armed struggle, armed resistance against the Axis that you're pointing us to. And we're going to kind of conclude here with two questions that deal with this. And this kind of penultimate question deals with a particular book that you were involved with about um, one of these communist partisans. And here's my copy of the book, by Hanna Levi Haas, Diary of Bergen-Belsen, 1944 to 1945. This edition for our viewers, published by Haymarket Books. Sorry for the shameless plug, but it is one of my favorite publishers, and it's an extraordinary story about a communist partisan from Bosnia who was deported to Bergen-Belsen. So, could you tell us a bit about her, Emil, and what happens to her, and how you got involved in this project? You were very involved in writing a piece at really at the end of the book.
Yes, so it's an extraordinary story, and I stumbled upon it. I didn't know about it for a, I was doing the readings for my qualifying exams in graduate school, and there was a footnote about this obscure book published in German that was called It Was Only the Beginning. It was published by some East German or West German communist publisher in West Berlin in the 70s. Very obscure, nobody knows about. But luckily I found this book in the library, read it. It was a German translation of a diary of a woman from Yugoslavia, and I had no idea that there was this woman who was in Bergen-Belsen, that there was from Yugoslavia. And then I tried piecing together her story, and then I found her daughter who is an award-winning exceptional journalist in Israel, called Amira Haas, and I think some of your audience may know her work. And I wanted to, I realized, I've never seen this book in Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, Montenegrin, whatever. It must have been written in the original in Serbian or Bosnian or whatever you call that language. And what happened to that manuscript? And I need to publish this. And so I got in touch with Amira Haas and eventually through jumping through many hoops and kind of after years. And Jan, you can show the picture. It's the last photo. Um, Here's the Amira basically when they published the edition in English with Haymarket in 2016, Amira asked me to write a second afterward. She wrote a foreword and then afterward, and then I wrote the second afterward. And then we also managed to locate finally the original. The English translation was translated from the French translation, which Hannah Levy herself did after the war. But there was still the missing one in Serbian or Bosnian. And it's an interesting story, but not very important here. We found it, and the diary here is Belzena, 1944-1945 was published in Sarajevo 2 years ago in Hannah Levy's hometown. Now, Hannah Levy was a Sephardi Jew from Sarajevo who early on became interested in leftist politics and kind of sympathized with the Communist Party. And she she did her studies, went to college at the University of Belgrade in the 1930s, where it's not clear, but I'm guessing she became kind of affiliated with the underground communist movement. In the late 1930s, she moved to Montenegro. She became a teacher, and because she was Jewish, it was very difficult to find a teaching position in Belgrade or in like a big city. So she was kind of exiled or left to teach elementary and secondary school in this town in Montenegro called Danilovgrad, which became occupied by Italy in 1941. But she was part of this partisan movement. I think she was, according to her own stories, related, not in the diary itself, but by Amira Haas, who interviewed her many times. She was a medic in a partisan unit, and then after the fall of Italy, she was arrested and deported by the Germans to Bergen-Belsen. And that was in 1944. She was captured in 1944 and deported to Bergen-Belsen. And the amazing thing is that her diary is one of the kind of few diaries that we have from Belsen, which was one of the most notorious German camps. At that time, it was called it was so-called exchange camp. It was a camp where Germans would bring people they deemed of some importance to the Western allies that they could maybe exchange for German prisoners of war or otherwise in negotiations after the war with the Germans. But regardless of this kind of special status, It was a camp run by dysentery, by typhoid fever. People were dying en masse of infectious disease. This is also a camp where Anne Frank died in 1945 of typhoid fever. Um, and so Levi's testimony, her diary that she kept at great danger to herself, is an essential kind of document that we have from this period. Not only about, it speaks about, Hannah's leftist politics and her Yugoslavism and her kind of visions of a future Yugoslavia that would be democratic and kind of equal for everyone, but also materially for as the students of the Holocaust and the situation in Belsen. This is one of the few firsthand accounts that we have about life in Bergen-Belsen, and as such, it is invaluable. And I'm very happy and proud that I played a little part of in locating the original manuscript and having it published in Hannah's own language in her hometown of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
think it's such a wonderful thing, like when I read this, it for our viewers, and I hope they do go out and track it down. It's beautifully written. Like she's a very powerful writer, especially given the circumstances. I mean, these are entries, so you're getting short entries. But I thought I would just read something, just a paragraph very quickly before we conclude. This is an entry from February 1945, so a couple of months before the British. There's also some Canadian troops liberate Bergen-Belsen in mid-April. Um, and she's talking, I mean, I think she fears for her own survival, that she won't make it. She won't last uh, until liberation comes. And she says, quoting her here, "Hunger crushes the spirit. I feel my physical and intellectual strength diminishing. Things escape me. I can't think properly, can't grasp events, can't realize the full horror of the situation. Only once in a while, in moments as brief as a flash of lightning, a clear and precise thought crosses my mind, and I wonder, what is this dark, perverse, underhanded force that succeeds in hurling humanity as a whole into such absurd and abominable conditions?" So something about the strength of her intellect. Obviously, she does make it, and this book has this quite amazing journey, as you just described, Emil. But I think for people who read it, they will see that she is a tenacious individual. There's much in here about sacrifice and will and resolve. Like we have to crush the fascists, we have to beat them, we have to organize. And there's much in here about solidarity. She certainly is not exactly thrilled with sort of the bourgeois habits and attitudes of some of the other inmates that she encounters in the camp, but it's so unrelentingly honest and powerful. I hope people will read it. And while we're at it, before we wrap up, I thought I would also mention to our viewers, since we're talking a lot here about the communist partisans, that some may know the book already. Milovan Djilas's Wartime, that's been in English translation for decades, is still people still pick this book up when they're trying to understand and get some insight into the experience of Tito's partisans, obviously from someone after World War II who ran afoul of Tito, the problems, the conflict between Djilas and Tito. He was an important Marxist thinker, communist thinker in Yugoslavia after the war, in addition to the role he plays during the war. But I should warn readers that he does not spare much at all about the brutality of this conflict, um, about the fighting and the ideological fervor that is there. There's talk in here, of course, about the execution of prisoners of war. It's a ferocious war, and Gilas really does take you through that. So, with that said, why don't we wrap up? You've given us so much of your time already, and we're very grateful for that. A question about Tito's partisans, about why you think they end up triumphing, maybe kind of again pulling that together. And I think this is something will weigh on a lot of people given the interest right now in the history of resistance movements. Um, that you could talk about democratic elements in this communist movement, despite what people may have in terms of stereotypes. But Tito's own politics, the politics of his movement and party, they certainly do move in an authoritarian direction, in 1945. So what could you say about that, Emil, in terms of wrapping up this webinar on Yugoslavia and World War II?
So I Tito is a fascinating figure, and sometimes it's at least to me, I'm now in an age like when the war started in 1941. Tito was 49 years old, so not exactly in the prime of his youth and like a young revolutionary, and yet he, with great resolve and leading this ragtag force against the most formidable enemy that was Nazi Germany, and triumphed, and that's such an unlikely story, and kind of amazing to think about. But it's also important to note, I think, that his movement was never really democratic. Tito was fiercely devoted to Stalin until 1948. In some respects, he was a more Catholic than the Pope. Stalin actually had to restrain Tito's forces from aiding the Greek communists after the war, when the civil war in Greece was raging on. Tito took an uncompromising position that Stalin had to, influence with respect to Trieste and the fate of this part of northern Italy and Istria, and whether that would end in Yugoslavia or Italy after the war. So Tito was not exactly a Democrat, but he did build kind of a movement during the war that was democratic in its outlook of encompassing all anti-fascist forces within the movement. There were Orthodox priests who were in the movement. There were who were by no means communist. There were members of the pre-war bourgeoisie, and kind of today, an anathema for any communist to kind of consider even being allied with them. And yet he managed to organize this army and emerge into an army in the first place, and an army that would win the war in Yugoslavia with Soviet support and with the Allied support, but largely an indigenous force, an indigenous victory, by investing all of these different segments with the understanding that this battle and this struggle was in their interest. And when you think about it, it's not even illogical. The Tito's force was the only force in the entire country of all the occupations and collaborationist forces and other paramilitary forces. This was the only force that took as its frame of reference Yugoslavia, the pre-war country that was invaded and occupied. So we're not fighting for greater Serbia. We're not fighting for greater Croatia. We're not fighting against the Serbs. We're not fighting against the Muslims. We want to liberate Yugoslavia for every Yugoslav, number one. And number two, we are inclusive. We're not excluding the Jews like almost everyone else. We're not excluding the Serbs like the Ustaše. We're not excluding the Muslims like the Chetniks. There's inclusion and kind of understanding that Yugoslavia is in the interest of everyone. And the story of Tito's success, I think, is the story of his the crux of this comes from this epic chaos and random violence that gripped the independent state of Croatia, and the kind of seed of victory was Tito's ability to mobilize all these communities. Not everyone. There were significant numbers of Serbs who were anti-communist and who were with the Chetniks. There were significant numbers of Croats who were with the Ustaša. There were significant numbers of Muslims who were with the Ustaše. But to kind of forge a multinational, multi-ethnic, inclusive coalition that then was motivated to fight against the Germans and for the future Yugoslav state. And people say, he took an anti-democratic turn, he forged the election. The election in 1945 were not legitimate. They were not, and it's true. But I would say that at that time, in the immediate in the lead up to the end of the war and the immediate aftermath of the war, Yugoslavia and this movement had political legitimacy as liberators and as people who had conquered evil and defeated evil. And whatever happened afterwards, and there were unsavory things that Tito did, and but there were then also other things that he opened the country to the West after he split with Stalin in 1948. There were not, it's a whole other story about Tito's post-war trajectory. He died in 1980. But I would say that his main accomplishment was to have this political pragmatism and genius to forge a very unlikely multi-ethnic egalitarian force that was somewhat underpinned by communist ideals, but not necessarily. It was these were toned down during the war. They became very repressive and kind of primary later when he took real power in Yugoslavia. But he managed to forge this unlikely coalition in the time of genocide, which is nothing short of amazing.
There's so much there, to really parse. I mean, you had noted that he becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia in 1937, right in the middle of the purges and show trials that the Stalin regime is carrying out. So his Stalinism, you pointed to, is a central part of his political identity. There were other Marxists, socialists there and elsewhere who were not Stalinists, or certainly not to the degree he was, or even anti-Stalinist. But since he was the central figure in the movement, that movement carried this Stalinist politics with them. As you noted, the nation is much more important in the way the Tito struggle presents itself than like revolutionary proletarian internationalism. It's the nation, a national liberation army. I'm really struck by something you noted in that the article I referred to earlier. That something like 800,000 people end up fighting with the communists during World War II. That's just an extraordinary number, and something like 100,000 of them are women who are not only in this force but are fighters in this force. They're really just smashing a lot of gender stereotypes at the time about what women could even do in contributing to a war effort. And Hannah Levi Haas's diary reflects a lot of that too.
Yeah,
So there's these contradictory moments, sort of some democratic and egalitarian aspects against national chauvinism and anti-Semitism and the like. And at the same time, there still is this Stalinist core that never is
yeah.
relinquished. I think you're pointing to the fact this is a very complex phenomenon when you start looking at it politically.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for I think you brought those threads up really well and yes. So thanks.
It's certainly of great interest to me, and I think I've learned so much from this, Emil. So let me thank you, and on behalf of my colleague, Professor Jan Mann, who's been handling things behind the scenes, thank you, Jan, for taking care of all the slides today. This was a wonderful webinar, covered so much ground today, and I hope our audience will join us for future webinars. We'll continue this series on really dealing with issues of war, revolution, and genocide, focused on Eastern, Southeastern Europe. We're not done yet, so we will continue those. But for the moment, Dr. Kerenji, let me thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks, Jan, for running things so seamlessly. Great pleasure to be here.